Well, my brother, I'm so sorry I didn't get to help you move, but it sounds like you get all taken care of. Can't wait to get up and see your house. Congratulations on owning your own place again. I know that's got to bring a lot of freedom to you. So, as always, you ask billion-dollar questions. The idea of God's awareness that did God know that Satan was going to fall? Did God know that we were going to fall? And if so, why does God create Satan? Why does God create us? Why does God give free will? Yeah, wow. Okay, so a couple questions I would have. Number one is, kind of our assumptions we come into the conversation. Do you believe that people have free will? That's a huge distinction, right? Because the conversation goes way in a different way if you think that God does not provide free will. I would argue that when you look back at the story of the book of Genesis, or look back at the story of the Bible, you look in the book of Genesis, chapter 1 really doesn't speak to it. Chapter 2 begins to speak to it. There's this idea that God, in creating the garden and creating humanity, God gives responsibility to humanity. Okay? And so when God creates Adam, right? God gives Adam work to be done, to care for the garden. So with that, as soon as God is giving responsibility to people, in some ways God is surrendering some of God's power, or at least some of God's sovereignty, sharing it with people. That may sound like a crazy idea, but think about it. When Jesus commissions his disciples right after his resurrection, he says, "All authority on earth and heaven's been given to me, and I give to you. Now go." Right? So we see each time God extending or giving power and authority. So Adam is given authority to work, and then when Adam is given relationship with Eve, Eve is given powerful authority or responsibility in being able to bear life. Right? She's the only one of the two that can make life, to have the act of God of being creative like that. So we know that first God gives people responsibility and authority. Literally, God gives dominion, which is a godlike quality. Therefore, I would argue with that there has to be free will built into that. Number two, the second thing we find out is that when God places the trees in the garden, right? There's the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, the Bible never, not once, seeks to explain why the tree would have two options. It's just automatically assumed that by the very order of creation, that there is the option for the experience of both good and evil. Now, this is where the Bible has a gigantic gap, because how do we go from Genesis 1:31 to the fact that everything is good, very good, right, to now in Genesis 2, the idea that humanity has the capacity to experience both good, the knowledge of good and evil, right? So, and of course, when we think about knowledge, we're thinking about the Hebrew idea of actually a felt knowledge, not a head knowledge, but a felt knowledge, such as I know that it hurts when you hit your finger with a hammer, right? Done that. I know that I felt that. So, to say all that to say, but doesn't God know the future, right? Doesn't God know what's going to happen? I don't know. That's a great question, because if so, then there's all kinds of questions. So let's just say God knows the future. God knew that Adam and Eve would rebel. Then we have to ask the question, why in the world would God put the tree in the garden? Did God tempt us and set us up for failure? That's a possibility. Another possibility is the fact that when God created the garden, that tree wasn't there. The tree is the result of Satan falling to the earth, right, being cast down. Possibly that could be a gap between Genesis 1 and 2 when the serpent falls to the earth, possibly. But I don't think that's exactly the case, because there seems to be, at the end of Genesis chapter 1, and the order of creation is finished, all 7 days are done, there's no mention of the serpent being cast down, and everything is still very good. So, I mean, maybe the serpent is the reason why the knowledge of good and evil is around. Or maybe it's just the capacity or the awareness that good and evil is always possible, and that good and evil is residing within us. that we are a mixed bag of creation. Now, the question is, finally get to the point, Rob, what about Satan? Did God know that Satan would fall? I don't know, actually. I don't think there's anything in the Bible that seems to indicate that we can speak 100% for sure and say, yep, God did know or God did not know. When God created Lucifer as an angel, there was never any intention for God's angels to fall, but they did, right? And God had to cast them out to the earth. So the whole argument can be fueled or can be creative by a group of people called open theologians or open theology. Open theology is the idea that God actually doesn't know the future because the future doesn't actually exist yet. So tomorrow doesn't exist. I mean, it exists like hypothetically, I can like imagine it, but in actuality it doesn't exist. So the future doesn't exist yet. And open theologians, open Bible scholars believe that we, along with creation and God, we are creating the future. So what we decide today really will impact and create tomorrow. Now, that is a super hot take. Some people get really, really upset by that because our image of God is that God is all powerful, that God is all knowing. But if God is all powerful and all knowing, that also has some problems. So, for example, let's look at the tragedies of our life. Let's say, a grandfather backing out of his driveway accidentally backs over the child that he 100% loves more than anything, right? And all-knowing, all-powerful God would be able, hypothetically, to prevent that and knew it was going to happen. So why doesn't God prevent that? Right? That's a problem. Open theologians have a little easier space with that because they say that God didn't know and that God is limited in God's power and authority on the earth because God has allowed humanity to have power and authority in limited ways on the earth. Therefore, maybe God couldn't have stopped that car that backs over the grandson. Maybe that's in the power of humanity. And maybe the grandfather, because he didn't look in his rearview mirror, that's the consequence, right? Or maybe the grandchild who's 7 has been told many times to not have his bike in the back of the car and not to be riding his bike around the cars. There's a consequence. So I think that open theology explains better the problem of evil, but then open theology presents all kinds of questions about the future, meaning what happens when we talk about we want Jesus to come back and to heal all things, and how do miracles work? If God has limited power, then what are we praying about? Maybe God can't suspend the natural, normal effects of the world. Then what do we do with that? Open theologians will say it's because we have our whole understanding of prayer wrong. Prayer is not really about us trying to twist God's arm and for God to intervene, but really prayer is about for us to listen to God and to find out what is God's will for us in our world, namely that we take time to pray, to study God's word, to hear from God, to know what God longs for in the world. So maybe in prayer, rather than for me to pray that God would feed the homeless people in Pikeville, maybe in prayer God is going to tell me how to feed the homeless in Pikeville, because God's hands and feet are me and you and where we're at. So I didn't answer your question about Satan because I can't answer the question about God knowing the future or not, or God being all powerful or not. I actually think that the Bible speaks in some ways in both sides of the mouth when it comes to these issues. There's some moments in the Old Testament where God is completely 100% sovereign, knows the past, present, future. God is all powerful. God sends tornadoes and floods, and you name it. God stops the rain, etc. But then there are other places where God seems very vulnerable, meaning God changes God's mind in the dialogue with Moses. God repents when it comes to commissioning Jonah. God was going to destroy the Ninevites and says, well, I decided to change my mind. Right? I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to relent from that. So I don't think we can actually answer that with definitiveness, because the Bible seems not to.